Hello, hello, hello. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar. What that means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and have been for a very long time, ever since I was a young boy. First discovered Tolkien in the 80s, and here I am in the year 2024 answering your questions. And I'm generally the person that you can come to ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion or any of his other works. You can come to me and I will do my best to give you a thoughtful response. That being said, we have 16 questions to get to this week. I didn't write as much this week, but I still had plenty of good material for a video. If you want to submit a question, the best way to do so is on Quora. You could just ask a question in the comments. I have no problem with that, and I answer as many of those as I can. But if you want to be featured in a video, there is a link to Quora in the description. It will go directly to my account, and you can ask a question there. If you don't have an account, it's very easy to set up, as you can sign in with a Facebook account or a Google account. I think there might be other options, such as Twitter or whatever. Or whatever they're calling Twitter these days. It's still Twitter to me. But anyway, like I said, we have 17 questions to go through. And just to give you a very quick channel update, we are currently, as of this recording, at 1,561 subscribers. And that's really great. That's absolutely fantastic. We hit 1,500, just last week. And, we're barreling towards 1,600. So, there's that as well. I did say at one point that, an eventual goal being 10,000 for streams to be simulcast to both Twitch and YouTube, I might make that 5,000, depending on how the revenue streams pan out and how much money the channel is making, because this is a big time sink for me. This is a huge, huge amount of time. I have to find the right questions. I have to spend time researching. I have to answer them and write up the answers. And then, of course, the recording and the editing and everything involved, and there's multiple people involved, and I have a lot of other things going on as well. If you follow the channel, also, there's a link to my Twitch in the description as well. I know some of you guys, you don't want to use Twitch. That's fine. You don't have to have a Twitch account, by the way, to watch on Twitch. You don't need an app or anything. You can watch right on your computer. You do need an account to participate in the chat. But if you just want to watch, you can watch on there. But all Twitch streams that are Tolkien related, which are typically Thursday nights, not every Thursday night, but twice monthly, we have two different Tolkien streams. One is a reading stream. We just started the Fellowship of the Ring. That video is up here on YouTube already for members, and it will be live early next month for everybody else. And we also do the Council of Tolkien. So when I put out those little videos that say, hey, I'm live on Twitch, you really don't need to say, oh, but I won't watch Twitch. That's fine. You don't have to watch Twitch. Those videos get deleted shortly after the stream is done. It's just to let people know that I'm live. They can come over. All of the Twitch streams will be uploaded to YouTube. Absolutely 100%. It's just they will be, of course, as all of my videos, available to members first, usually a few weeks early. And these weekly videos that I do every Wednesday night are available 1 week early for members as well. So membership is worth it, I think. It's only $5 a month, and you get some cool emotes. You get to see all the videos early, and you get to support the channel. So that's really big. Right now, the majority of what I make from this is through ads. So if you don't want to see ads, the only way you could really do that is to get YouTube Premium. But and of course, watching my videos while having YouTube Premium does help me. Absolutely, I do get revenue off of that. But ads are the biggest revenue. I don't actually pick and choose where the ads go. I just sort of let the AI take care of it. But if there's a lot, I'm sorry, but the videos are like an hour long. So, and there are not that many ads really. I just think that sometimes people just don't want their videos interrupted at all. And I totally understand that. I totally get it. If you're getting like a lot, it's probably a mistake because it's different for everybody. It's sort of dynamic. So one person might not get an ad in the same place that another person. This is just the nature of YouTube. I assure you that I'm not the one choosing to put a whole bunch of ads. I just let YouTube decide what's best, because they have an algorithm, and the algorithm, if you trust the algorithm, then it will treat you well. Anyway, that being said, if you like the content and you haven't subscribed, do subscribe. I will remind you again at the end of the video, because if you make it all the way there, then you surely will subscribe. But let's get to your questions. Actually, before we get to your questions, let's get to a reading. And I just sort of randomly grabbed Beren and Lúthien, and I was thinking I might read not one of the poetic parts, but one of the prose versions of the Tale of Tinuviel. So I think we'll go with that. Let's do that. So this is a version of the Tale of Tinuviel from an earlier draft. This isn't canon or anything. It doesn't have any bearing on the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings or anything. This is just an older version of. There are many, many, many versions of Beren and Lúthien. Let's try that again. 2 children had Twinwillant then, Daeron and Tinuviel. And Tinuviel was a maiden, and the most beautiful of all the maidens of the hidden elves. And indeed, few have been so fair, for her mother was a fay, a daughter of the gods. But Daeron was then a boy strong and merry, and above all things he delighted to play upon a pipe of reeds or other woodland instruments. And he is named now among the 3 most magic players of the elves, and the others are Tinfang Warble and Avari, who plays beside the sea. But Tinuviel's joy was rather in the dance, and no names are set with hers for beauty and subtlety of her twinkling feet. Now it was the delight of Daeron and Tinuviel to fare away from the cavernous place of Twinwillant their father, and together spend long time amid the trees. There often would Daeron sit upon a tussock or a tree root and make music, while Tinuviel danced there too. And when she danced to the playing of Daeron, more lissome was she than Gwendoling, more magical than Tinfang Warble neath the moon. Nor any may see such little thing save be by those only in the rose gardens of Valinor, where Nessa dances on the lawns of never-fading green. Even at night, when the moon shone pale, still would they play and dance, and they were not afraid, as I should be, for the rule of Twinwillant and of Gwendoling held evil from the woods, and Melkor troubled them not as yet, and men were hemmed beyond the hills. Now the place that they loved the most was a shady spot, and elms grew there on beach too, but these were not very tall, and some chestnut trees that were with white flowers, but the ground was moist, with a great misty growth of hemlocks rose neath the trees. On a time of June they were playing there, and the white umbels of the hemlocks were like a cloud about the boles of the trees. And there Tinuviel danced until the evening faded late, and there were many white moths aboard. Tinuviel, being a fairy, minded them not as many as the children of men do, although she loved not the beetles and the spiders, will none the Eldar touch because of unguiliante. But now the white moths flittered about her head, and Daeron trilled an eerie tune, when suddenly that strange thing befell. Never have I heard how Beren came thither over the hills, yet was he braver than most, as thou shalt hear. And 'twas the love of wandering, maybe alone, that had sped him through the terrors of the Iron Mountains until he reached the lands beyond. Now Beren was a gnome, son of Egnor the Forster, who hunted in the darker places of the north of Hisalome. Dread and suspicion was between the Eldar and those of the kindred that had tasted the slavery of Melkor, and in this did the evil deeds of the gnomes at the haven of the swans revenge itself. Now the lies of Melkor ran among Beren's folk, so that they believed evil things of the secret elves. Yet now did he see Tinuviel dancing in the twilight, and Tinuviel was in a silver-pearly dress, and her bare white feet were twinkling among the hemlock stems. Then Beren cared not for whether she were Valar or elf or child of men, and crept near to see. And he leant against a young elm that grew upon a mound, so that he might look down into the little glade where she was dancing. For the enchantment made him faint, so slender was she and so fair, that at length he stood heedlessly in the open, to better gaze upon her. And at that moment the full moon came brightly through the boughs, and Daeron caught sight of Beren's face. Straightway did he perceive that he was none of their folk. And all the elves of the woodland thought the gnomes of Dor Loman a treacherous creatures, cruel and faithless. Wherefore Daeron dropped his instrument, and crying, "Flee, flee, O Tinuviel, an enemy walks this wood," he was gone swiftly through the trees. Then Tinuviel in her amaze followed not straightway, for she understood not his words at once. And knowing that she could not run or leap so hardily as her brother, she slipped suddenly down among the white hemlocks, and hid herself beneath a very tall flower with many spreading leaves. And here she looked in her white raiment like a splatter of moonlight shimmering through the leaves upon the floor. So you can see this is there's some similarities with the very earliest poetic versions, and some similarities with the Silmarillion as well. The names are very different. Of course, Tinuviel is not really an older name for Lúthien. It is a Sindarin name, and as a matter of fact, that is the name that is usually used in The Lord of the Rings. She is referred to as Lúthien, but she is also referred to as Tinuviel, especially by Aragorn. And of course, in this, it is mentioned that she is of the elves, which is interesting because her father is an elf. Her father, Twynwillant, who later became Ilu Thingol in the later, and her mother, of course, was a fae, meaning a daughter of the gods, which is interesting because originally the gods were the name that he was calling the Valar, and the Valar are mentioned. He does say Vala in that, but it is understood or believed in Middle-earth that they are gods, even though they are very much not gods. So they refer to as gods or powers or Vala. And in this sense, we know that she's a daughter of Melian, who is a Maiar, which is not exactly the same thing as a Vala, or rather it is the same thing, but not of that elite group. The Ainur is the general term for all of the angels, the Valar being the powers, the 15 greatest of all of the angels, whereas the rest of them, at least the rest of them that went into the world, are called Maiar. And here, you know, in this early stage, Tolkien did have the Valar especially having children. And as a matter of fact, for example, Tulkas was a child of the Valar, Nessa was a child of the Valar, and such and such and such. And he later abandoned this and had it where the Valar would not propagate themselves. We understand that the Maiar can because Melian did. At least she did with an elf. And the daughter here is referred to as a fairy, even though she is of the elf folk. Also notice she has a brother here, Dairon, which is interesting. And they mention, of course, that she doesn't like spiders because of Ungoliant, although there is I closed the book right, look at the name, but I think it's Ungoliante is the older name of Ungoliant. So the linguistics are still being hammered out. Melkor at this point is still called Melko. We didn't get to the parts about Sauron, but in that instance, he's still a cat. He's still called Tevildo. Of course, later he became Thu the Necromancer, and then eventually Sauron. So it's not the very, very earliest version, but it's one of the earlier prose versions as opposed to a epic poem. Anyway, it's time to get to your questions, so let's start right here with the first one. So here's a question that came in by the request of Robert Montgomery, who asks, if Arien was a Maiar of fire, could she be considered an uncorrupted Balrog? Almost would be my answer to you there. I would say that you would almost be able to say that. It's sort of a misnomer, I would say. The term Balrog is specifically a corrupted fire spirit, so an uncorrupted one is, by definition, not a Balrog. The word Balrog is derived from the primitive Quendian word Nualarco, which became Valarauco in Quenya and Balrog in Sindarin. All of these translate to the same thing, demon of might. The first part, Ngual, Vala, Baal. They all mean power, just like the Valar are the powers. And the end part, Rauco, or Rog, means demon. So I've always said that Arien is sort of the answer to the question, what if a Balrog was good? But she's not a Balrog, because that title is specifically demonic and therefore fallen, while Arien is quite the opposite of that. She is not fallen. As a matter of fact, she is ascended up into the sky, carrying the sun. And I got a great comment here from Dave Owens, who has submitted some questions in the past as well, who said that asking if Arien is an uncorrupted Balrog is sort of like asking if an angel is an uncorrupted demon. And you can sort of say, well, yeah, kinda, sorta, but it's sort of a misunderstanding of the linguistics, I think. But I guess the answer is yes, but not really, or no, but kinda. It's in that weird gray area. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in by the request of Jeffrey Clabber, who asks, who was the most perfectly cast actor in Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings movies? So, yeah, perfectly cast is a tough one, because I could easily nitpick any casting to death if I wanted to. Peter Jackson mostly did a good job with casting the characters in The Lord of the Rings. I could argue a few of his choices as being, if not bad, then at least flawed. Elrond and Frodo come to mind right away, but he mostly got it right. The most perfect casting, though, is easy for me. And I know a lot of people in the comments were saying, well, what about Samwise? Because I didn't pick Samwise, and everybody sort of expects me to pick Samwise because I always say he's the best part of the movies. They really got him right. And the reason that I didn't say that Sean Astin was the most perfect casting for Samwise is because he wasn't the most perfect casting. He overcame not being the perfect casting by acting perfectly. He was such a good actor that he embodied Sam, even though he really doesn't look like Sam. Sam is not a chubby guy in the books. As a matter of fact, of all the four hobbits, the chubby one is Frodo. At least at the beginning of the story. He definitely slims down as he's walking to Mordor. But Sam, being an outdoorsman and somebody who works with his hands, a gardener, and also somebody who isn't rich and therefore doesn't always get that 6 meals a day that hobbits prefer to have when they can get it, he probably doesn't get as much food, so he would be, not very muscular. I was going to say he probably would be muscular just from working out so much, but he wouldn't be chubby like that. But Sean Astin did a perfect job playing the character anyway. But as for perfect casting, I have to say it's Ian McKellen as Gandalf. He's the most perfectly cast, which is an interesting thing because he was the fourth, or you might even argue that he was the fifth choice for the role. Sean Connery turned the role down. Patrick Stewart turned the role down. Christopher Plummer turned the role down, all for various reasons. Sean Connery didn't understand the script. Patrick Stewart didn't like the script. And Christopher Plummer simply did not want to travel to New Zealand to film. It's not often that you would hear that the fourth string choice is the perfect choice. But Ian McKellen embodied Gandalf so well that it's sort of hard, at least for me, and I know for a great many people, to imagine anyone but him in that role. I mean, I do imagine other actors in that role, and sometimes I think, well, that would be very good. Like, if they ever did it again, I think J.K. Simmons would make a very good Gandalf. Of course, Ian McKellen is apparently not done playing Gandalf. He said he would play Gandalf in the Gollum movie that's going to be coming out. As long as they hurry. He says, I have to still be alive, obviously. But like I said, you could arguably say he's the fifth choice because the first choice, I mean, obviously the first choice I mentioned was Sean Connery, but really before even that, it was Christopher Lee, because Christopher Lee dreamed of playing Gandalf his entire life. And Christopher Lee was in fact the first person to be cast for The Lord of the Rings. But he realized that at the age that he was at and in the health that he was at that time, Gandalf was too physical of a role for him, and he had to sort of settle for playing Saruman, and he kind of did a perfect job there as well. So, yeah. The wizards, at least in The Lord of the Rings, were cast perfectly. And what's interesting, I didn't even get into this. You could even argue that Ian McKellen was the sixth choice because Peter Jackson actually wanted to offer the role to Sylvester McCoy, who wound up playing Radagast in the Hobbit films, which he was a great cast for Radagast. He just wasn't a great depiction, and that's not his fault. It was just he played it the way the character was written. The issue with that, the reason I didn't say that earlier, is because he was never given an offer. He was never offered Gandalf, whereas Patrick Stewart was offered it. Christopher Plummer was offered it. Patrick Stewart was offered it. The studio basically said no to Sylvester. He wasn't, I guess, famous enough. So there's that as well. So, yeah, I would definitely say, I thought about this quite a bit. I would definitely say Gandalf was the most perfectly cast, even though they went through so many names before they arrived on the perfect one. And sometimes I guess that just has to happen. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Mike Bloeneers, I hope I said it right, who asks, what would Fëanor or Fingolfin have been like with Sauron's Ring of Power? In just a single word, terrifying. In The Lord of the Rings, Galadriel gives us the terrifying scenario of what would happen if she came into the One Ring. I'm going to read you that part of the Two Towers here, or I'm sorry, of the Fellowship of the Ring here. And now at last it comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair. One as great as Galadriel taking the ring would be absolutely awful. Now let's look at what Gandalf had to say on the matter. This is from the Fellowship of the Ring as well. Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity, pity for weakness, and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me, I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me. Neither of these great beings, one of the greatest of the Eldar and a very powerful and wise Maiar, trust themselves with the One Ring. Gandalf doesn't even trust himself to hold it, much less use it. Elrond also had something to say on it. Here's another section from the Fellowship of the Ring. We cannot use the ruling ring. Now that we know all too well, it belongs to Sauron and was made by him alone, and is altogether evil. Its strength, Boromir, is too great for anyone to wield at will, save for those who have already a great power of their own. But for them it holds an even deadlier peril. The very desire of it corrupts the heart. Consider Saruman. If any of the wise should, with this ring, overthrow the Lord of Mordor, using his own arts, he would then set himself on Sauron's throne, and yet another Dark Lord would appear. And that is another reason why the ring should be destroyed. As long as it is in the world, it will be a danger, even to the wise, for nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. I fear to take the ring to hide it. I will not take the ring to wield it. So imagine, if you will, either of Galadriel's uncles taking up the One Ring. Fëanor would be terrible in his mind, the marred greatest elder, coming into the power of domination, and his craft being second only to Aulë himself. He would create a great many rings of power and have an army of Fëanorian Nazgûl at his disposal. Nothing would stop him. Fëanor's power was enough to battle all 7 Balrogs at the same time, and even as he died in that battle, he lasted for a very long time. The fact that he was able to hold his own against 7 Balrogs for any amount of time is amazing. And then consider Fingolfin, much more virtuous as a character, closer in temperament to Gandalf than to Fëanor, but in his wrath as terrible as the Valar. The last thing that he would need is more power, especially evil power. However, like Gandalf and like Galadriel, I think that Fingolfin, at the least, would have the wisdom to turn down such power. Fëanor might have the wisdom. He might think of it as, I don't want this because it's from Sauron. But if he didn't know that it was from Sauron, he might take it up and he might use it, and it would be terrible. Okay, next question. Here's one that came in from Cat B, who asks, if either of Thorin's nephews had survived the battle at Erebor, would the throne have passed to them? Do you think this would have had a great effect on the future events in Middle-earth, given that they were so much younger, not as experienced as Dain? No, actually, Dain II was next in line to be the king under the mountain either way. Upon the death of Thorin II Oakenshield, and the next eldest in line of Durin would take the throne, and that would be Dain II Ironfoot, who was only 26 years younger than Thorin II. The survival of Fili and Kili does not change that. The only thing that it may change is that later in The Lord of the Rings, when Dain II Ironfoot dies, if Fili was still alive, then he would become the king under the mountain before Thorin the Third Stonehelm would. Interestingly, though, when I was looking at dwarven genealogy to answer this, I noticed that the line of Durin favors the line of Dain the First rather than that of his brother, Beren, which is why the cousins that are descended from Beren, such as Balin and Gimli, were not king of the mountain, under the mountain. They were not ever in line to be king under the mountain. This may have spurred Balin's reasoning for defying his king and taking up in Moria, because he would never be a king of Erebor, at least. But he could become the Lord of Moria, at least for a very short amount of time, sadly. Okay, next question. This question is also from Catby, and I really like this question since I see some insight in it. Since the Silmarillion is said to be of elvish lore translated, could there be elven bias regarding the Nauglamir? I always wondered what the dwarves' telling of those events might go. Absolutely, 100%, that could totally be true. In the early Legendarium, in the early drafts of it, I should say, the dwarves were straight up villainous. One of the earliest stories was Beren and Lúthien. We read a little bit of an early version of that just a little while ago. And it bore little resemblance to the version in the Silmarillion. Lúthien, or Tinuviel, as she was also called, was not an elf. She was a fairy. Beren was an elf. Or they called him a gnome, although that wasn't a different sort of creature from an elf. It was a specific type of elf. Gnome later became Noldor. And the reason that Tolkien changed it is he was reading these stories to his friends, and they were all confused. They were thinking of garden gnomes. They didn't quite understand that the gnomes were elves. So he had to change it. And the dwarves were called a treacherous race. We see some of this bleed over into the later Legendarium, the published Silmarillion, mostly related to the death of Ilúthingol via dwarven treachery. So we don't feel bad later on when Beren and a bunch of Ents hunts down the dwarves responsible. Of course, Tolkien changed his mind about dwarves as a whole. Of course, there were bad dwarves, and there were good dwarves as well. We are even told that the dwarves told their king a twisted version of the events. But was it really twisted? Possibly, but possibly not. The Silmarillion is elvish lore, and therefore it is the elvish view of how things happened. Not necessarily true events. It's the events the way that the elves wrote it down. It is likely as close to true as we may find. But even Tolkien toyed with the idea that not a single bit of it was actually true, and that it was just elvish legend, much as the Book of Lost Tales was the Mannish version of the Silmarillion. In the Silmarillion, one can even attribute legitimate errors made by either the author or the editor, such as including the incorrect parentage for Gil-galad, as bad record-keeping in Middle-earth, or a mistake, or editorializing by the translator, Bilbo Baggins. The Silmarillion, in-universe, does not have a single source. Rather, I should say it doesn't have a singular source, save for of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which we understand Elrond to be the singular source of that particular section. And the elves will tell the stories the way that they remember them, or the way that they choose to remember them. So, obviously there was an elvish version of that tale, and there was a dwarvish version of that tale, because we know that the dwarves told some sort of story to their king, and of course from the elvish perspective it is a twisted version of the events. Maybe it was a twisted version of the events. Maybe they did lie to their king, or maybe not. Maybe their version was truth and the elvish version is twisted, or of course the truth could always lie somewhere right down the middle, that there is a bit of the elvish story that is true and there is a bit of the dwarvish story that is true, but they're also both being sort of deceptive and trying to make themselves look better when it could have been they were both at fault. That being said, we don't know what the dwarvish version is because we aren't privy to it, and Tolkien never wrote it. Okay, next question. Here's a question that comes in from Giuliano Greco, And this is a movie question. Why didn't Gandalf and King Théoden have a go at Legolas for killing Wormtongue? I mean, he just knifed Saruman in the back, and Legolas goes and kills him when he could have sought redemption. Okay, so obligatory, it wasn't in the book. That's out of the way. Let's actually answer the question. So I'm going to put a picture here. Remember this scene? That is Théoden trying to kill Gríma Wormtongue. Aragorn stopped him. Gandalf did not stop him. Gandalf's standing right there. He didn't stop him. Aragorn stopped him from killing Gríma Wormtongue. And this also, of course, didn't happen in the book, but, you know, whatever. Anyway, Gríma then goes to Saruman and he tells them about the weakness in the wall at Helm's Deep, which led to quite a lot of loss of life. And by the way, not in the book, but we're talking about the movie, so it's totally fine. I'm sure that Théoden was not really broken up that Gríma got shot by an arrow. Gandalf didn't really seem to care. He wasn't stopping Théoden from killing Gríma the first time. Now, in the book, Théoden didn't want to kill Gríma. He actually said, let him go. Even give him a horse if he wants one. And Éomer made a crack at it. He said, well, if a horse will take him. Gandalf might have even thought that Gríma Wormtongue's death was a sort of mercy. But it's possible that in the movie, at least, they didn't care about Gríma very much at this point. The real question is, why would Legolas even do that? Why would he shoot him? And the answer is simply that in the book, Gríma kills Saruman, and then he's shot by arrows trying to escape. Legolas was not present. Only hobbits were present. But in moving the location and the time of this death, someone had to shoot him with an arrow. To tie up loose ends. I mean, I suppose that it didn't have to be an arrow, but he was all the way at the top of a tower, and Legolas was the only one holding a bow, and he's one of the main characters. So it just sort of made sense. They die in the book, not in that exact way, although it's similar, and not in that location, and certainly not at that point in the story. But the basic idea of Gríma killing Saruman with a knife, and then Gríma being killed by arrows, is essentially what happened in the book. So if they're going to include that scene at all, it has to be somebody. So Legolas is the guy with the bow. It doesn't really make sense. There are a few things in the film that don't really make sense. Why would Legolas do that? That doesn't really make sense. But they're great films nonetheless. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from somebody who just merely goes by DBR, who asks, in the Lord of the Rings books, there was a dead marsh with lights of a certain places. Was this the remains of a battle or a graveyard? So, of course, you're talking about the Dead Marshes, and it was the remains of a battlefield and also a bit of a trap. The Dead Marshes were an important battleground for the War of the Last Alliance, and as the marsh expanded, it was used as a strategic point during Gondor's later wars with the Wainriders. The Wainriders drove Gondor's forces into the marsh, and they were killed. And then when Gondor received more backup, they did the same thing to the Wainriders. They drove them into the marsh, and they perished. So there's men of Gondor, there's elves, there's Wainriders in there. It is important to know that the books themselves, the bodies are probably actually long gone. Gollum discovered this when he tried to eat one of the corpses, and he found that it wasn't really there. It was just sort of an apparition. Obviously, this is sort of a version of the Foxfire or a Will-o'-the-Wisp sort of thing, where decaying bodies cause these swamp gases to become sort of luminescent and such. Of course, it's a much more magical version of that, a much more mythical version of that. And if you want to read a little bit about this, it's actually in the Lord of the Rings. It's in the appendix, though. You have to read through the appendix to hear all about how the Dead Marshes happened and whatnot. Okay, next question. Here's a question that comes in from somebody who simply goes by Alexandra, who asks, wasn't the Silvan elves bothered by the wasting of their souls over time in Middle-earth? They seem unbothered by that, unlike the Eldar. So there's no actual wasting of souls in Middle-earth, but rather a fading of the body that comes over the period of many millennia. If an elf spends a very long time in Middle-earth, exposed to the taint of Melkor, without sailing to the uttermost west, they will eventually fade. This is not a degradation of their soul, but rather the soul of the elf becomes greater. It overcomes the body, and it leaves them in a state that is called houseless. They are spiritual beings at this point. In this state, they can be compelled by Namo, one of the Valar, to come to Mandos in the uttermost west, and then they can, at this point, get a new body. But through a great strength of will, a houseless elf can indeed resist this summons and still remain in Middle-earth. The elvish Fëanor, which is what they call a spirit, is greater than that of mortals. Fading as a process isn't really greatly expanded upon in Tolkien's Legendarium. We aren't given a description of it other than the spirit overcoming the body. It is possible, I'm going into the realm of surmise here, it is possible that aging may be an early sign of fading. Círdan was described as very old in The Lord of the Rings, with silver hair and a long silver beard. Early on, Tolkien intended for elves to have a sort of third cycle of life, where after many, many, many years they will grow old and they will be able to grow beards. But later he abandoned that. But Círdan remained old in The Lord of the Rings. Now, he's a Sindar elf who is among the very oldest of the elves to have spent his entire life in Middle-earth. Círdan's advanced age may actually be an early sign of fading. My hypothesis here is backed up by the fact that none of the similarly old elves in the Undying Lands were ever described as aging like this, such as Ingwa, for example. Another reason that this may hold true is due to the fact that Gwyndor was captured by Morgoth, and he was tortured by Morgoth, and after being released, he was aged. And he was not gone that long. I think it was only like 20 years. So fading happens only in Middle-earth, and it's a result of Morgoth's taint in the land, but being directly exposed to it like that in such a short amount of time, being tortured directly by Morgoth, may have partially faded Gwyndor, and of course spending tens of thousands of years, well, over 10,000 years is what I really should say, Círdan has started to age and started to sort of like partially fade. And if he never sailed to the west, he may become houseless. Of course, he does eventually sail to the west in the Fourth Age. We do know that thanks to the prologue of The Lord of the Rings. Okay, next question. Here's one from the Oski Boski who asks, was Aulë upset when his student used his knowledge against the children of Ilúvatar? So this is funny because my first thought is, which one? which of Aulë's students? I assume you mean Mairon, who became Sauron. He was a student of Aulë, but you could have meant Théoden, also known as Curamo or Saruman, or you could have meant Fëanor, who was also a student of Aulë. Aulë didn't really have a great track record for students. I mean, maybe he did. Maybe there were so many other that were great, but it seems like a lot of the bad ones came from him. Aulë's opinion of the matter of his students going so awry so often, or at least 3 times, which is pretty often when you stop and think about it, was never recorded. Though I would state that he likely felt badly. Once again, we're getting into the realm of surmise. And I would say that this is due to how he handled one of the other Valar students straying away. Aulë was a student of Ulmo, who, like Sauron, joined with Melkor. Aulë had a love of destruction. He's the Lord of Storms, and Melkor allowed him to indulge in this urge to destroy. It seemed that the Valar never really chased down their own, though in this case it was Aulë who managed to get Aulë back in line. I mean, they did chase down Melkor, but they learned their lesson from that. So it was actually Aulë who came up with the whole idea to send Uinen after Aulë. Uinen and Aulë wound up falling in love, and they were wed, and he came back into the light, and he was forgiven. It's conjecture, but it seems to me at least a deliberate choice that Aulë specifically had this idea, rather than literally any other Valar. It wasn't Manwë, it wasn't Varda, it wasn't Yavanna, it wasn't any of them. It was Aulë. Now, I would say that perhaps this was a form of atonement for him, for some sort of perceived flaw on his part of the teaching of Sauron and Saruman and Fëanor. Okay, next question. All right, this one comes in from Billy Godfavor Birdos, who asks, why don't orcs make a coup to overthrow Sauron and rule Mordor for themselves? Well, orcs are a lot of things, but they're not really ambitious. Orcs never seek great power. They always gravitate towards some sort of big bully that they could rally around. They don't particularly like Sauron, nor do they like Morgoth, but this is because evil is never cooperative. I have more to say than that in another question that we're going to get to. Evil can only hate, and so the evil creatures all hate each other. The orcs hate the Dark Lords hate the orcs, Sauron and Saruman hated each other. The orcs don't even get along with each other very often. They will quickly fall to infighting. Orcs are sort of the lowest level of the totem pole here, and they gravitate towards big powers, even if they hate them and they speak badly of them. Sauron put a call out for all evil creatures to join him in Mordor, and they were all compelled to join, except for some of them that were in Moria and Isengard. Even if Gollum was caught up in this, and he detested Sauron. He didn't like Sauron. He didn't know of Sauron until he met him, and then he hated him. As a matter of fact, the only hate that burned greater than Gollum's hatred of Sauron may have been Fëanor's hatred of Morgoth, and still Fëanor was not exactly a force for good after his fall. Sauron is so great that the orcs cannot help but follow him, and he doesn't even need the One Ring to compel them into his service. They don't have the will, the organization, the numbers, or the knowledge, or the power to overthrow him. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Joshua Crisco, who asks, what's the deal with the dead men of Dunharrow, Isildur's ability to conjure such a magic curse, and the Deus Ex Machina feel to it? This comes out of nowhere, and the Battle of Pelennor Fields goes from certain defeat to cheap, easy victory. Yeah, that's not the way it happened at all. Isildur has no such ability, and the dead men of Dunharrow did not fight at Pelennor Fields. Isildur has no power to deny anyone the gift of man, which is death, the ability to pass beyond the world and be with God, who is called the Iluvatar. However, these men made a sacred oath to God, who takes these sort of things very seriously. You cannot take Iluvatar's name in vain. He will make you feel the consequences of any such oath. One such oath, which was taken by an elf named Fëanor, was to retrieve the Silmarils at any and all cost, and that all who took the oath were forced to murder anyone who got in their way, even their own kind. Even as some of Fëanor's followers regretted taking the oath, they still could not abandon it. It scratched and clawed at their souls and compelled them onwards. Isildur was a man, a great man, but a man nonetheless, and he doesn't have the sort of power to do that. The dead men of Dunharrow are anchored to Arda, which is the earth, by this oath, and they cannot leave until it is fulfilled. Similarly, contrary to what the movie portrayed, Aragorn has no power to release them from this oath. Only Iluvatar does, which is why after they fulfilled their oath by assisting Aragorn in attacking the Corsairs of Umbar, they vanished. They did not come to Minas Tirith. They did not fight at Pelennor Fields, but Aragorn had quite a force in the book without them. He wasn't merely with Gimli and Legolas, but he had the company of the Dunedain, including Elrond's sons, as well as all the slaves that were freed from the Corsairs. It was these very real and corporeal beings that came to Minas Tirith and broke the spirits of Sauron's forces, who, by the way, were losing. Sauron was already losing the battle, and they were hoping for backup from the Corsairs. The Corsairs were supposed to come and save them from this loss, but Sauron, he wasn't doing so well. He was losing due to the ferocity of Rohan. Saruman was supposed to take care of Rohan, and he failed. Éomer had witnessed the death of Théoden, and he believed at this point that his sister Éowyn was slain. She, of course, was not, but She was lying on the ground. She wasn't moving. He thought she was dead. And he was in a rage, and he was a force of nature, as was the Prince Imrahil, who was completely left out of the movies. The Prince of Gondor was left out. Prince of Dol Amroth, a prince of Gondor. Faramir became a prince as well in the book. Once Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, Elladan, Elrohir, and all those guys, all those slaves, and all the rest of the Dunedain arrived on those ships, it was really all over for Sauron's forces. Of course, this wasn't Sauron's entire army. This was one battalion, essentially. But this loss allowed Aragorn, Gandalf, and Imrahil to press their advantage to Mordor and distract Sauron from what was going on in his own lands. And that's why Frodo and Sam were able to cross Mordor without really being bothered all that much. Okay, next question. Here is a question that was requested by Gregory Miller. If the wizards are considered incarnate, are the Balrogs considered incarnates also? Yes, absolutely, but just in a different sort of way. Gandalf and the rest of the Istari, which are wizards, are examples of voluntary incarnates. They were given bodies by the Valar, and they were bound to those bodies. They took the form of adult men, though Gandalf chose an older form. These bodies are somewhat like the bodies of men, but they age a lot slower. Now, Gandalf, very shortly after arriving, he received the Red Ring, Narya, from Théoden, and that actually halted his aging. Over 2,000 years later, the rest of the wizards sort of caught up with him. They had all become old like him. It's a common misconception that they all chose old bodies. Only Gandalf did that. Saruman, for example, was described as tall with good posture, and he had jet black hair. And then 2,000 years later, he looks so much like Gandalf that some people mistake him for Gandalf. Balrogs, however, are involuntary incarnates because they became stuck in their forms. Compared to, like, say, Sauron, he never really incarnated himself. He could make himself appear as fair or terrible on a whim, though later he would lose his ability to make himself fair. The Balrogs are Melkor, that's Morgoth, his oldest followers. They're sort of the original demons. Unlike the likes of Sauron, who were seduced into his service, the Balrogs were the Ainur, who were with him from the very start. And in coming to Orda as evil spirits, their form reflected their nature. Okay, next question. So here is another one from the Oski Boski, who asks, are the Valar an allegory to seraphs from the Bible? No, there is no allegory found in Tolkien's Legendarium. The question itself, actually, I would say, confuses what an allegory is, which is a point that Tolkien made at many points. The Valar were not allegories of angels. They literally are angels, much as Ilúvatar is literally the god of Abraham. He's not an allegory for God, he is God. Melkor is not an allegory for Satan, he is Satan. Tolkien wished his work to be compatible with his own beliefs while having a creation myth that was very unique. You'd say the Bible is the creation myth of modern man, the Silmarillion is the creation myth of ancient elves. An allegory is not meant to be just merely an allusion to something. For example, Tolkien stated the most obvious bit of his belief that came through in The Lord of the Rings was that Lembasbred was basically the Eucharist. However, this is not an allegory, it's an illusion. Christopher Tolkien once said that people will find allegories where they may, meaning that people will impose an allegory on a work, even if it was not intended by the author. Tolkien, for his part, correctly stated that an allegory has to be on purpose. It has to be intended by the author. And what people were doing was applying their interpretations to his work, which is application, not allegory. Tolkien loved application because it gave the reader freedom to take whatever lessons they wished from his work, or they could apply the lessons that he did teach to any aspect of their life that they wished to. Tolkien did use allegory in one story. It wasn't part of the Legendarium. It wasn't anything to do with Middle-earth, but it was a short story that he wrote called Leaf by Niggle. And it was about a painter who wished to finish a grand masterpiece and found himself distracted by life and responsibilities, and he was very slow in working. And in the end, only the bit of the painting that started it, a single leaf, is known to people. The painting as a whole could be seen as the Legendarium, whereas the single leaf is the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien openly admitted that Leaf by Niggle was an allegory to explain his writing process and why his work is unfinished, and it is the perfect example of an allegory. It's obvious, and it's not really open to any other interpretations. His good friend C.S. Lewis was mostly known for a series called The Chronicles of Narnia, and it's obvious Christian allegory that has no other applications. One could choose willingly to ignore the Christian allegory of Narnia, but they cannot remove the Christian allegory from Narnia. Tolkien's work contains his thoughts, and he did refer to his work as didactic, meaning that it was literature that could be seen as educational, but he balked at calling it theology, and he had a healthy distrust of allegory. For those who insist on applying lessons to his work, that is fine, as long as you're applying them, but insisting that Tolkien obviously intended for his work to be based on, say, Christian theology or this war or that war is just not true. It's incorrect. You can find his thoughts on religion, you can find his thoughts on war baked into his work, just like you can find the thoughts of any author on a great many things in anything that they write. I would advise that the next time you read The Lord of the Rings, don't skip the foreword. That's really important, because he debunks all of this very easily and hastily. I'm going to read 2 little paragraphs from the foreword that's found in The Fellowship of the Ring. Here's the first one. Other arrangements could be devised according to the tastes or views of those who like allegory or topical reference, but I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and have always done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author. And here's another part of the foreword. As for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. As the story grew, it put down roots into the past and threw out unexpected branches, but its main theme was settled from the outset by the inevitable choice of the ring as the link between it and the Hobbit. Okay, next question. Here's the one from the thumbnail. I don't always like to put the one from the thumbnail near the end. It just happened to be this way. And this question came in from Gregory Miller, who asks, if Morgoth didn't have the flame imperishable, how did he make dragons? The same way that all the other Valar created life. It's a common misconception that only Ilúvatar can create life, using the sacred fire, also called the flame imperishable. I hear it so often that I've grown accustomed to the sound of the groan that I make when people write this. People, really, please, try to think critically on this. When the Valar came into Arda, they were a bit dismayed to find it empty of life, contrary to the visions that they had seen, or it was full of life. They realized it was up to them to create the life. They filled the world with plants and animals. That's life. These flora and fauna, which Tolkien in the elvish language called Kelvar and Ulvar, were all created by the Valar. Only the children, of course, were made by Ilúvatar, and they were already there. They were deep in the earth waiting to awaken at a certain time. Melkor cannot create. It's just false. He created dragons, he created orcs, he created trolls and other fell creatures. Sauron created vampires, werewolves, and he even improved on the trolls by creating the Aulë. These are all forms of life. The idea that evil cannot create is an incomplete thought. It's a sentence fragment cherry-picked from Tolkien's explanation to make a limp attempt at finding a gotcha. The lesson of Aulë and Yavanna and the creation of the dwarves and the Ents early on in the story is often trotted out. Aulë's creations did not have free will. They were his puppets until Ilúvatar breathed true life into them. Thus, only God can create true life, right? This is, as I said, an incomplete thought. Only God can create intelligent beings with free will. This does not mean that the Valar could not create unintelligent life or life without free will. We see examples of this all throughout the Silmarillion. Examining the first dragon, Glaurung, we are told a few things that show that he did not, in fact, have free will. His gaze was that of Morgoth. His voice was Morgoth's voice. He was essentially a furtherance of Morgoth's will. Not a unique, beautiful creature who could choose to be good, but a doomed creature of malice. There aren't good dragons, just as all of Morgoth and Sauron's creations cannot choose to be good. They do walk and they do talk, and in some cases they have the appearance of free will. The Orcs are the biggest examples of this. Evil, as I mentioned earlier, is non-cooperative. They don't have any love of their masters Morgoth and Sauron, but we never, ever, even once see an example of an orc who chooses to be good. I could argue about the origins of orcs back and forth all day and how it applies to their will, which seems to be less free than one may think. But the question is about dragons, so I'll put it to you this way. Melkor found a loophole. The loophole is, of course, what Tolkien referred to as Morgul magic, or necromancy, the manipulation of souls. He cannot give a dragon, a troll, or an orc a human-like soul, but he can take a human soul and put it into a vessel, and then enhance the vessel. Melkor cannot create anything beautiful, because he's evil. Melkor cannot create intelligent beings that have free will, because he is not God. But he can create terrible things in his own image, and he can create mockeries of true life using necromancy. Okay, next question. Is the Silmarillion considered a story or a historical account of Middle-earth? It's a historical account, and it's told in the forms of various stories. There are stories of these tales in Middle-earth, which we see in differing accounts in the Fall of Gondolin, as seen in the Book of Lost Tales, seen in universes, Manish, perhaps Númenórean accounts of what happened. The Silmarillion exists as an actual book in Middle-earth, as well. It's called Translations of Elvish Lore by Bilbo Baggins, given to Samwise before Bilbo sailed to the west, and added to the Red Book of Westmarch. The in-universe conceit is that a version of the book made its way to the Undying Lands, perhaps from an elf carrying a copy to the west, and then someone named Elfwine came in the 6th Age and brought it to Ambion, which is England, and had it translated from Westron to English by J.R.R. Tolkien. Out of universe, it's an outline for Tolkien's Legendarium, and an unfinished one at that. It's intended to have these stories be spun off into other larger, more detailed accounts. I talked about this a lot last week. The Lord of the Rings being a detailed account of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. However, out of all the other great tales, most of them were in a terribly unfinished state when Tolkien died. The Children of Húrin being the closest to being finished. Most of the tale is not in the Silmarillion, though. Other parts of it were first published in unfinished tales before eventually being compiled into a single narrative much later. Okay. And now we're going to get to our last question. Here's a question that came in from KJ's Curiosity, who asks, why doesn't Saruman flee to Mordor after his defeat at Isengard? So, directly following the sack of Isengard, he was afraid to move, and after this, he was trapped for a while, we'll say. Saruman feared the Ents. He called them demons, and he would not step out of his tower until he came to the balcony to parley with Gandalf. At this point, he was offered pardon in exchange for his staff and the key to Orthanc, a deal that he rejected, and so he was remanded to stay in Orthanc by order of Gandalf the White. Saruman did manage to talk his way out of Orthanc by feigning repentance to Treebeard, who allowed him to leave. He stated later, when he spoke to Gandalf about this, that he was no jailer. Now let's talk about Gandalf's terms. He asked for the key and the staff for pardon, but he did state that Saruman would be free. He would be able to go anywhere he wanted after this, even to Mordor, if he wished, though Gandalf pointed out that that would be very bad for Saruman. I'm going to read you the relevant passage from the Two Towers. Reasons for leaving you can see from your window, answered Gandalf. Others will soon occur to your thought. Your servants are destroyed and scattered. Your neighbors you have made your enemies, and you have cheated your new master, or tried to do so. When his eye turns hither, it will be the red eye of wrath. But when I say free, I mean free. Free from bond or chain of command, to go where you will, even to Mordor, Saruman, if you desire. But you will first surrender to me the key of Orthanc and your staff. Then shall be pledges of your conduct, to be returned later if you merit them. So Saruman had tried to cheat Saruman, and everyone knew... Saruman had tried to cheat Sauron. Everyone knew this, most of all Sauron, who knew his treachery from the start. So Saruman would have no chance at this point of getting into the Dark Lord's good graces. He would not last long if he went to Mordor. He would wind up being locked in Barad-dûr and tortured to death. It would not be good for him. And he knew this, That's why he didn't go there. He went to the Shire. So there you have it. Okay, that was the last question. I had a lot of fun with this episode. I've been finding that I've been having a lot of fun recording these. It's interesting because as I sit down to record all these little videos that I then edit into one big video, I sit there and I say, oh God, this is, I'm tired and I kind of want to go to bed and it's late but I got to do this. And then I start doing it and I get all hype and excited and I have a lot of fun. And you can see I'm just smiling here, just talking about this stuff makes me very happy. So anyway, guys, if you made it to the end of the video and you're not subscribed, you should definitely do that. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, turn on notifications, all that jazz, the hoops that make you go through these days. It's just the way that YouTube works, and we all just have to sort of live with it. Consider membership if you really enjoy the content. You'll get to see everything early, and you'll help support me in a more direct manner. I will see you guys next time.